MailChimp. Also, there will be details posted on the website. We have some really nice lectures scheduled, and we're in March, on March 18th. Remember, our programs are the third Saturday morning of the month at 10 a.m. And we're scheduling them here at the Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District, and as I mentioned, by Zoom as well. Our next program is going to be 2 graduate students from UC Riverside that are doing some really cool research with foraging behavior on wildflowers by bees, and then also some plant-animal interactions, plant-pollinator interactions in the desert, from the desert up into the higher elevations. It should be really interesting. They will be half-hour segments, for the lectures and the questions. And then we have a bunch of field trips coming up as well. One at Hartford Springs. It'll be led by Jenny Iyer, who is one of the authors, along with her mother Barbara, of the Wildflowers of the Inland Empire. She knows Hartford Springs and the Gavilan Hills extremely well. We will have, this is just a sampling. We'll have some other wildflower hikes and over towards, where is it? Towards Swathard Canyon and Mormon Rocks, another one over at Puma Canyon Ecological Reserve in Pinyon Hills. We'll have a field trip along the Santa Ana River during the blooming of the Santa Ana River woolly star, an endangered species that Aaron Eccles will lead, and much more. So do look at the calendar, try to save some dates for that. Is that working okay? Okay, so now, just so you know, I'm supposed to go through this spiel. And so today we're going to have a lecture that's going to be introduced by Orchid in a few minutes. But we just want to let you know that California native plants are really special. From the Joshua tree to the poppy fields to the redwoods, California has an amazing diversity of plants and habitats. And we live in one of the most botanically rich areas on Earth, which is really cool. So we want to experience what's out there and to share it with other people and educate them about preserving and conserving and enjoying that environment and all our native plants. We're a nonprofit organization, the California Native Plant Society. We have now more than 11,000 members. We have 36 local chapters now. So we've just formed a new chapter recently. And together, we're really working hard, as I mentioned, to conserve wildlands, protect endangered species, collect scientific data, and to restore nature to our home and public landscapes, one garden at a time. So none of us, insects, the birds, nor humans can exist without plants. That's a real important message. Save plants, we save everything else. And saving plants saves habitats too. So if you're inspired by what you hear today, please get involved in the California Native Plant Society. If you're not a member already, or if your membership has lapsed, remember to renew or to join. It's really easy to join. You just go to cmps.org /join. And you can see more about what we're doing. You can sign up for our chapter's mailing list. We send out MailChimps of all our events in advance with the details. And, now I'm going to have Orchid Black introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. I want to welcome our speaker. Scott Kleinrock is the Conservation Programs Manager for the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, which is a big mouthful, but many of you will have found that online through the Inland Valley Planner. Scott has a master's degree in landscape architecture from Cal Poly Pomona and a bachelor's from UCLA. Prior to joining the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, Scott was the landscape design and planning coordinator for the Huntington Library, Art Collections and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, where he led the planting design of the Brody, California garden. And he is a sustainable landscape advocate, educator, designer, and horticulturist. And welcome, Scott.
Okay, let's some logistics. Screen sharing. For being here, everyone. It's my pleasure to speak with you all for a talk called Saying Native Last. This is a talk that I put together for the California Native Plant Society state conference, but I'm really excited to talk to a more local group about this idea. Definitely here in Southern California, there has been a push and really much more interest in native plants in these last couple of years by local community members who might not have been interested before, and that's great. However, I think we're kind of at a time where we need to be looking at two different groups for how we promote native plants and try to bring more people into the native plant movement. And so that's really what the first part of this talk is about. And in some ways, I think about it as there's kind of a native plant bubble. And inside the native plant bubble, we have people like everybody in this room today and everybody online today, people who have made it to a California Native Plant Society local chapter meeting. And we want to encourage more people to join our bubble, to get passionate and interested about native plants. And there's been some success in that in the last few years. But if we really look at what we can do as native plant advocates, and even if you don't see yourself as one, if you have arrived at a CNPS meeting, you are officially drafted to be a native plant advocate. Our next level of success would be to get native plants more and more often into average landscapes, average home landscapes, average commercial landscapes, average municipal landscapes. And in my role at the Waterwise Community Center, which I'll talk about in just a moment, I speak with a lot of average community members, average homeowners. Most of them do not want to consider themselves gardeners. They do not want gardening to be their hobby. They might be ready to get rid of their lawn and try to do something else, but when they hear the term native plant, it either means nothing or sometimes there's actually negative connotation. And so if we are truly going to be successful with kind of expanding the native plant movement as wide as possible, we also need to collectively learn how to engage these audiences that are just not quite as interested as we kind of have become. And so this talk is kind of based on things we've tried. A lot of stuff hasn't worked, some stuff has seemed to work over the past 5 years at the Waterwise Community Center to promote California native plants to new audiences, to take as much momentum as we can related to the drought and to kind of pour that into expanding the adoption of native plants and landscapes, and then also to continue to defend their installation during times of drought and watering restrictions. And so we'll get into that at the end, is how we have, as native plant advocates, even in the deepest depths of drought, can really still advocate for the fact that establishing native gardens is worth the water that it takes to do that. And so with that, let's get going. Okay, here we go. So briefly, who am I and what am I doing here? So you heard a little bit about me. The organization or the public agency that I work for is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. So very briefly, we're a special district that provides water conservation services to the western edge of San Bernardino County. So we don't provide water at anybody's meter. We don't provide drinking water. We were established in 1949 when the area was all agricultural, essentially to capture water that would otherwise leave our community and make sure that it's going to be available for local water supply, capturing water and sinking it into the ground. And we serve the western edge of San Bernardino County, upland to Rancho Cucamonga in the north, to Chino and Chino Hills in the south. However, the vast majority of our programs and our facility are free and open to everybody. And so that's how we started, created by a public vote in 1949. And the bread and butter of what our organization does is groundwater capture, water that would leave through our channelized stream systems, captured and literally infiltrated in old gravel pits, cleaned through natural processes, becomes part of the local groundwater supply. But our board also realized a number of years back that now that our area has urbanized, that's only half of the water conservation equation, because if we're capturing water and then it's significant amount of it is just drooling off into the street from broken sprinkler systems, watering unused lawns at night, that we're not taking the greatest advantage of that water conservation effort. And so we have today a demonstration garden and public park in Montclair, just south of the 10 freeway, about 3 acres of demonstration landscapes, not 100% native, but a significant number of native plants and native dedicated areas. We have in-person and online workshops all throughout the year on basically everything that someone would need to know in order to remove turf, redo irrigation systems, work with Waterwise and mostly native landscapes. Everything's free for anybody, and you could check out the schedule and sign up for that at cbwcd.org/Waterwise workshops. We have one coming up a week from today about habitat gardening with California native plants that I'll be teaching. And then we have a website, used to be called the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Now it's called the Waterwise Garden Planner. And I might, depending on how we're doing on time, show some of that at the end, because that really is the main way that most people reached us, and that we try to, in a very friendly manner, introduce people to working with Waterwise and native plants. And we have a YouTube channel with lots of content as well. So if you're interested in anything that we are doing, the easiest thing to do to stay up to date with all our resources and programs is sign up for our once-a-month newsletter, cbwcd.org/newsletter. And if someone could put that in the chat, that'd be awesome as well. So now let's get into it. And here's the good thing. More people than ever are thinking about getting rid of their lawns. We operate a public facility. Almost daily, we have people who have never thought about removing their lawn before and just assumed that lawn would be kind of the default landscape, questioning whether or not they want to continue taking care of their lawn, or often have abandoned it and now are ready to do something else and arrive kind of wondering what that should be. But at the same time, many people will still be the first person on their block to be putting something other than lawn in. And the vast majority of people who we interact with would be the first person to plant a California native garden in their immediate neighborhood. And within our service area, and probably throughout most of San Bernardino and Riverside County, it's neighborhood by neighborhood. You know, there are certain neighborhoods that there are way more than one California native garden in the immediate neighborhood. But this is kind of mostly what we are seeing. Most participants we talk to in most of our programs don't already know what the term native plant refers to or why that might be important. So oftentimes it's tempting for us to jump into talking about native plants. And I've had times where I'm talking to someone and half an hour later, I realize that they still think that the rosemary and lantana in their yard are California native plants. And so really not making assumptions about where people are and constantly reminding ourselves, for someone who's kind of soaked in the native plant world, that some baseline kind of education and understanding is important. There is lots of confusion between low water demanding plants, native plants, California friendly plants. There's so many terms being used that oftentimes with new audiences, if I'm doing a presentation, I take a few slides kind of introducing people to the different categories, and then especially why native plants is something kind of unique and potentially interesting. So really making sure that we kind of define terms is critical. And then here's often where lots and lots of people are. They're either ready to get rid of the lawn, maybe they've done it and they want to know, okay, well, what's next? What are my options? Barriers to moving towards low water gardens have been studied. There have been standard formal studies that water agencies have funded throughout the entire state of California. And it also, informally, we're just always polling people all of the time in our program. People self-report that landscape design is the most frequent barrier. That's what they see as the number one thing that they need help with to kind of get over the hump. But we also, at the Waterwise Community Center, ran a one-on-one landscape design assistance program for about 6 years. And what we found during all of that is that they also self-report that this is the number one barrier because it's the first barrier they encounter. It's the first thing that they realize there's kind of a stumbling block in their way. But we provided lots of designs for people, did polling, program assessment. They love the design, they want to put it in. And no matter what we did to try to tweak the program, we never got past about 50% of those people actually successfully installing that design. So design is really important, but we also need to follow that up with lots of other resources to make sure that people know, how to actually be successful installing and maintaining these landscapes. But design is a big draw. Design workshops are consistently our largest attended workshops for all of the topics we teach. And really, what we found really helps with design is focusing on do-it-yourself techniques and showing images from as many what I would call relatable properties as possible. A lot of the kind of design imagery available on the internet are million to multi-million dollar properties. And if we want to welcome as many people as possible into the native plant movement, what really kind of works well in workshops is showing lots of detailed step-by-step pictures of typical suburban 3-bedroom houses without huge yards. That's really really helps people make connections and starts to see how they can envision really doing this on their own property. As a side note, something if you're interested in design content or sharing kind of detailed design content with people, we are almost done. You can see at the bottom of the screen, creating an 11 video step-by-step DIY design YouTube series. It's not up on our main YouTube site yet because I'm still finishing some of the editing, but it is kind of available with a direct link, cbwcb.org/DIY design, where we literally walk people through envisioning what you want, how to do a site assessment, how to take all of your measurements if you want to do it on graph paper, things like that. Some people don't want to go in that much detail, but we did have a lot of people who are leaving our kind of shorter workshops who really wanted that content. And so we have created that. But importantly, most people we interact with do not want to consider themselves gardeners. They don't see gardening as an attractive hobby. They don't want to spend their time doing that. They might be willing to do some work for it, but it's about as appealing to them as mowing their lawn might have been. What we find that these people want is a nice landscape. Many like the idea of it being environmentally beneficial. They can do that at the same time, but they're not attracted to that idea of being a gardener. For these people, we really recommend keeping it simple. What I found in that design program as we worked with this kind of audience is usually using no more than 12 to 20 different species of plants total in a landscape, average front yard or backyard, is kind of about the limit. And in some cases, maybe 5 well-selected native species that are very reliable is all that are needed. For the average person, I love ceanothus and manzanita, but no ceanothus and manzanita in the average person's landscape. Things that are tried and true and are going to be easy for them to feel successful and learn the plants. Plants that won't have issues if they get a little bit of being overwatered in most cases. So that's really kind of key to engaging the audience. People, even at that 12 to 20 kind of level, are not often going to learn the names of all of their plants. And so realizing, really meeting that audience where they are and trying to set them up for success the best we can. And then also realizing that we really need to let people know what's in it for them. The idea that native plants are, the best thing to plant, or we really should, or that, that's what naturally adapted to growing here, isn't as effective, at least with our local audience, as kind of painting a picture. Something like, what if there was a group of plants that could have color all throughout the year, would bring birds and butterflies to your yard so you can sit back and watch them. They only need to be touched for care once a year, if at all. And on top of that, you might only water them every 3 to 4 weeks after they're established, even in the summer. Who wouldn't want that? Then after that, you can kind of get into, well, that group of plants does exist, and they just happen to be California native plants. So let's talk about California native plants. We find that for that general audience who has never heard of what a native plant is, that some sort of permutation of that kind of approach to engagement is much more effective, and kind of pitching it as having a native garden as part of a desirable lifestyle than starting with the idea of native plants. Because a lot of people, when they hear native plants, they think of the local mountains in the middle of summer. And literally, we have people all the time saying, well, I don't want a dried up tangle of things in my yard. So really focusing on what's in it for them. And we like to explore with people the idea and kind of lead them through the process of asking people, what do you want to put into your landscape and what do you want to get out of it in return? People are tired of hearing, you shouldn't have a lawn. And a lot of people who still have lawns are extra tired of hearing that. And so what we ask people is, how much turf or lawn do you actively want to use? And we let people know, if you have a dog, if you have a kid who's learning to walk, we're not telling you to take out all of your lawn, but we ask people how much you actually want to use, and what can you do with the rest of the space that will do more for you or your lifestyle than the turf ever did. And oftentimes when we engage people with that question, they might realize they have 3,000 square feet of turf and maybe 500 is enough for them, and they can hold on to that one section, maybe one irrigation valve, and they might be ready to actually get rid of the rest of it, even though they didn't really think about that, because in their mind, until then, it was kind of an all or nothing, lawn or no lawn kind of question. And so our big idea is that overall native plants do the most for people in our landscapes while requiring the least in return. Pretty simple equation, and it makes them an exciting choice. The idea that native gardens will turn any yard into a intergenerational place of lifelong learning. When your grandkids come to visit, they'll see butterflies, they'll see the different birds throughout the season, is a pretty popular idea. And beauty can absolutely be part of it. But we need to remember again here that we have multiple different audiences, and that some people have more flexible criteria for beauty than others. And I see two main groups and different ways to kind of engage in each group. And sometimes this is a little bit different than who is already interested in native plants and who is not. So some people, just aesthetically, they'll be ready for new things. They might be open to seeing the beauty and dormancy of balancing summer dry plants with evergreen plants, open to finding the beauty in dry foliage and seed heads, and how the morning light shines through dry seed heads, all those things that native plant people might wax poetic about. But the title of the slide, "You Think That Is Beautiful," comes from a talk that I did for a water district a few months ago, where I was talking about California buckwheat and talking about how those seed heads dry out and are actually quite lovely in their own way and tuning into those seasons. And a woman in the second row, I heard her very clearly turn to her husband, and she thought she was saying it under her breath, "He thinks that's beautiful?" And it was a great reminder to me that not everyone is ready to go there. And so we need to engage that audience where they are as well. And so some people might be open to the idea of the native plant concept, but it is just the fact that they will not buy into something that doesn't look tidy and green by conventional European landscape aesthetic standards. But a cool thing is that there's plenty of native plants for those people as well. And so those people would need options for lists of formal looking evergreen native plants, including ones that could be hedged. And we all might know, or some of us know, that you're not going to get your maximum habitat benefit by limiting yourself to that. But if you compare that to maybe the other Waterwise options that those people might put in, like lantana and maybe Raphiolepis, Indian hawthorn, that's like kind of maybe can water it less than a lawn. Certainly, we'd love to see beautiful evergreen native landscapes. And so on that Waterwise Garden Planner website, just for an example of how we're dealing with that issue, is we created a list of native formal looking top trees and shrubs where someone could put together a conventional by European aesthetic standards, buttoned up and tidy landscape of native plants. So making sure those kind of options are available, and they definitely are. So a few other ideas that seem to be working. Making sure that people know that they don't need to remove everything that's existing to start planting natives, and really being ready with some options of some native plants that can tolerate a little bit more irrigation in transition zones between lawn and dry gardens, or even mixed in with things like Indian hawthorn and crepe myrtles and other things like that that might be there. Rosemary and lantana, starting to work those native plants in if people aren't going to do a huge project. There are plenty of those that will be okay with that, even if they don't necessarily need that much water. Letting people know that combining with succulents or fruit trees, maybe that receive extra water through a separate drip irrigation zone on the fruit trees, is just fine. I've worked with a lot of people that just the shrubbiness of a typical native plant landscape, even if we're working with some perennials and stuff, but it's still a lot of shrubs. And they become much more open to the idea of working with native plants if there's a few non-native agaves or aloes, mixed in for that sculptural effect. It's not all or nothing. Most people want to have fruit trees if they have a yard in Southern California. So working with people on that, there's plenty of great meadow ecology plants that would be super happy working with fruit trees. So we kind of teach about that, demonstrate that as well. It's a good excuse to get in some of those slightly higher water demanding native plants that maybe in our drier zones they would be tricky with. We encourage people just hearing about native plants to consider planting at least 50% native plants. That seems a lot less intimidating than telling people you should plant the entire landscape of all of these things that you have not heard about before. Sometimes though we find, but by the time people start then researching native plants to think about that 50% goal, that's what they get really excited about, and they might even be leaning more in that direction. Helping people find the vision is critical. Photos of residential gardens with plants identified right there on the photo using common names has been one of our greatest tools to get people to feel like maybe they can do this at home. And the really focusing on common names has been something that's been kind of a learning process for me. I came from a botanical garden background, but Latin names, while they might be in some ways the clearest way to make sure a specific plant is identified, are just extremely intimidating to people. We sometimes do try to say, well, just write down the Latin name if you're going to go to a nursery and have it. But at the end of the day, within the most common 100 California native plants that someone new to natives would maybe be working with, there's going to be very little confusion if they go to the nursery with the common name. And overall, it's going to work out just fine. In addition to photos like that, showing process photos of those kind of real world landscape projects along with the age of planting, so people know what they're in for. So this happens to be me and my partner Kira's front yard. Right after planting, that idea of plant small, space it out, it's going to grow in. People hear that, but until they see the pictures, they don't believe that. And so showing it should look like nothing on day one most of the time. 6 months, if things are going well, you're going to start to see something, but there's going to be a lot growing. By a year, it'll be coming along. Those pictures from any native garden are extremely powerful in showing the process and getting people to have some faith that if they just stick with it, that it's going to kind of come together. In helping people find the vision, landscape design examples that will be easy to emulate, or that even people can hand directly to a contractor who knows native plants and say, I want something kind of like this just for my yard. is extremely powerful as well. And California Native Plant Society has made some great efforts over the last few years in providing some of those resources, and I highly encourage everybody to continue in that direction. You know, make them just for your neighborhood, for your neighbors, for whatever area. People really find great value in that. These are some screenshots for some of the design templates that we have on our Waterwise Garden Planner website. And when we started having this kind of content instead of just our kind of plant selection content, it became much less intimidating to people to start to kind of envision how they can put something together for their own landscape. And so something that we have done is kind of pairing more perspective visualizations with exact garden kind of bird's eye view plans that are at a spacing that people could even print them off on 11 by 17 paper and measure to really get their spacings. And some people will go that far and some people won't, but we're just trying to provide as many options for as many different types of people. Some people want to really get down to the details and some people don't. And then remembering we're plant people. I'm a plant person too. That's what I love about landscapes. But plants, in terms of a garden for especially someone who's not really a plant person, are just part of the garden look to be achieved. And so even though we are Native Plant Society people, if we want to engage people about their landscape options, thinking about balancing more formal, tidy, or even modern pathways with spaces that can be looser or wilder for those who care. Having well-defined walkways, patio spaces that can be kind of an organizing structure for the eye, as well as kind of replace some of the function that's lost by a lawn, where you could walk anywhere, set up tables and have people over, really helps people be a little bit more comfortable with kind of the wilder side of different approaches to landscaping. And combining that with a concept called cues to care is something that has worked out well for us as well. So cues to care is a kind of framework by this woman named Jo Nassauer, who was a landscape psychologist. She studied basically how people perceive landscapes. She worked in a very different bioregion where prairie was the main kind of landscape type. And she became very interested in prairie restoration front yards, because in her area, she was seeing that sometimes these prairie restoration front yards would go in and people would think they're great, this is beautiful, why don't more people do this? It's such an asset, lovely habitat, all that. And then sometimes a prairie restoration front yard landscape would go in and the neighbors would be calling code enforcement in the city saying, my neighbor has totally abandoned their lawn, it's going to be driving down property value. So what was the difference? And so she was an academic. She did this big study, all these visualizations. Long story short, she came up with something that is kind of intuitive at the end, but took a while to get there. Even if people have no idea what's going on with the plants in your landscape, they tend to like or at least accept landscapes that they understand are intentional and cared for. If they don't understand that this landscape is intentional and cared for, they are going to be more likely to not like it and have those sorts of concerns. And so what she found, and what led to the concept of cues to care, is that in these restoration style landscapes, even if the neighbors didn't know what was going on with the plants, any visual cues that this was an intentional or cared for landscape would go a long way towards neighborhood acceptance. And so this is a garden that I visited on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour a few years ago that I thought was a great example. Personally, I love the wild look. But for someone who doesn't know what's going on with the native plants, has never seen native gardens before, this landscape from the street would look extremely wild, especially without the split rail fence, the little piles of rocks, the paving stones to extend the space a little more. But the fence provides a sense of intention and containment to it. the rocks, this neighborhood is not covered in rocks. It shows that there's at least a little bit of craftsmanship and consideration. And then if you look deeper into the landscape, the pathway is very well maintained. It's not overgrown. And so all of those things, even to someone who has no idea what's going on with the plants, can be very impactful in the difference between someone calling code enforcement for someone thinking, well, that person's kind of eclectic, but they really put their effort into it. They did their thing to make a huge difference. And a lot of people are, especially those first person in the neighborhood to be putting in a native garden, a lot of people are really concerned about what the neighbors are going to think. So having this framework can help them think through the features in their yard to make them more comfortable with potentially adopting that wilder aesthetic. And matching wording to the audience, we've realized is very important to us. The idea of safeguarding biodiversity is an important idea, but that phrase is often used for audiences that might not have any inherent value in the term biodiversity. So considering for general audiences, starting with something more like providing homes for songbirds, butterflies, native non-stinging pollinators who need our help and our pleasure to see in our gardens is much more of a mouthful, or any iteration of that. But that goes much, much further than kind of more classroom ecology concepts for general audiences. And again, on that same thing, matching word to audiences, stick to common names. And even if you need to really focus on being consistent, consistently stick to the same common names. Don't backslide into Latin is something that really helps make inviting people into the native plant world non-intimidating. Attracting birds and butterflies is a major draw. This is probably our #1 entry into getting people interested in native plants. So one of the design templates we have on our Waterwise Garden Planner website is a bird and butterfly garden. It happens to be all native plants, but you have to read pretty far down into the description to even get to that point. Starting with birds and butterflies is the draw. That gets into that like saying native last concept. And that's not something that I really religiously stick to in any way, but it's often not the #1 selling point. However, for general audiences, attracting and providing for bees or pollinators is still not a major draw, even though we might assume from kind of being in the native plant world that those things go hand in hand. A lot of people hear bees and they think my children are going to get stung and they're going to anaphylactic shock, even if they're not allergic to bees. So leading with birds and butterflies, not necessarily with bees. I tend to really make myself use the term native non-stinging pollinators rather than bees. It makes a big difference for the average person just starting to think about this. Color is a major motivating factor. The idea that if you work with a native plant palette, you can have something in bloom every single month of the year is a big selling point for people, and helping kind of get them over the idea that native means dry in the summer. Especially with us in the Riverside, San Bernardino County area, or in the kind of valley areas, we can work with both kind of the chaparral, sage scrub, as well as the desert palette, and really have blooms throughout the year. I've had many people tell me that they don't like native plants, take a stroll through our demonstration garden, and come back with a list of plants that they like, only for me to be able to tell them with a big smile on my face that 90% of the ones they wrote down are native plants. So color is a big seller. And so to kind of conclude this part of the talk, really our biggest goal in promoting native plants, we realize, should be to have people leave with an almost visceral desire to have a native plant garden because of all the wonderful things it brings into their life. Not because of heady concepts like they'll be safeguarding biodiversity, not because they're bad people for having a lawn and they shouldn't have lawns, but that native plants are the most exciting way to landscape the spaces around us. And by the way, it also doesn't need much water at all. So that's really been kind of our focus. And so for the last part of the talk, just to kind of briefly go through this, and then I can answer questions related to this, or we can go into it as much as people want, is having a native garden sounds great, but do we have enough water to install and care for new native gardens with watering restrictions? So when I first put together this talk, we're still deep in our worst drought in 1,200 years. Unfortunately, you can see on the right-hand side, that's the updated slide from just this morning, much less severe drought in California. However, important to note that throughout pretty much our whole area, we are in still either moderate to, on the other side of the mountains from where we are today, severe drought still. So not quite as bad. We're not in epic drought anymore, but we're definitely not in the clear. And so watering restrictions are not going to be most likely really significantly lifted. Still early days, but we're not necessarily in the clear. And so we're going to look at a few numbers, but some ideas. In times of water scarcity, knowing about irrigation can let you be a stronger advocate for California native landscape. Even though for most people, it is really, really boring and really uninteresting and seems very technical. Every water provider has a different situation. Watering restrictions are different sometimes, across the street, based on which water provider is providing water to each house. Drought is an overarching factor, but every water supplier has a different supply portfolio, more or less local supplies, and so it's impacted differently. Restrictions that sometimes to people from the native plant world make no sense, we need to realize are generally intended for lawns, because the vast majority of people still have lawns, and for sprinkler systems, that kind of makes things a little bit tricky. But in most areas, hand watering is allowed with no restriction. So that's great if people have the time and inclination to hand water their native plants to get them established. We're pretty much in the clear. Native plant advocates ideally should be able to actively and accurately engage with officials. Water agency officials usually come from a water resources background and are not native plant people. They're not horticulture people, but they are doing the best they can with the knowledge that they have. I speak with lots of them in my work. They usually have limited technical knowledge about landscape. So people who want to advocate for native plants, having some of that technical knowledge can be very powerful. These officials usually have good intentions and are willing to engage with people who want to speak with them in a calm and reasonable manner. They're used to getting yelled at all the time. So when someone would like to share a difference of opinion or thought or concern in a common professional manner, that normally goes pretty well. And so here's some of the big ideas, and these are just, one of my big ideas is that if this technical part has no appeal to you at all, every native plant advocate doesn't need to know all of it. But somebody in your circle, somebody in your local group, a few people in your chapter knowing this information and being able to be called to engage in these more technical conversations is really powerful. So recommendations might be different, but realistically, if we are going to defend kind of California native plant establishment and ongoing care in times of drought, in the midst of water restrictions that are clearly intended for lawns, but then sometimes get applied throughout the region in a more general way, here are some kind of baseline useful numbers to know. Your exact recommendations might be different. These examples I put together are kind of a range based on what I've used in my professional practice, as well as reaching out to other people who I've either learned from over the years or who are colleagues of mine who are kind of steeped in native plant horticulture in their work as well. So during the establishment phase of planting a native plant garden, kind of get things going, usually the first year, maybe 2 years, depending on conditions, we need to be able to apply approximately once per week somewhere between the equivalent of a 1/2 inch and a 1 inch rain event. And so what does 1 inch mean? That's really important. That kind of means as if there was almost like a solid 1 inch of water, like there was 1 inch of water in the bottom of a bathtub or something, suspended over that whole garden area and then allowed to trickle in. Depending on your soil type, that is always going to go much deeper than an inch, might go 6 inches down, might go a foot down, but it's going to percolate much deeper down than an inch of penetration. So applying between half an inch and 1 inch of water, approximately once per week, totaling about 2 to 4 inches per month during establishment. After establishment, in most of Southern California, most home gardeners who aren't really going to have a restoration style, let it go completely dry landscape are still going to water native species some. And usually that's going to be between 1 inch and 1.5 inches applied as a single irrigation event every 3 to 4 weeks. So dry for 3 to 4 weeks and then a deep soak. And so that's going to total up the equivalent of about 1 to 2.5 inches per month. Native plant water demand in general, your situation might vary. If we look at our inland Southern California valley areas, and we compare that to turf, by the time you look at sprinkler inefficiencies and all of that, in July, which is our hottest month of the year, typical turf grass is going to require about 8.3 inches of irrigation for that month. While with native gardens, first of all, we don't need to worry nearly as much about irrigation inefficiencies. We want to be as efficient as possible, but the native plants have deep, wide root systems that are going to find that water. So if it's a little bit drier in one spot and a little bit wetter in another spot, they're not going to care about it like turf grass will. So with our native plants, we're going to find, we just mentioned that 1 inch to 2.5 inches of water probably applied per month. So 8.3 versus 1 to 2.5, or 1 to 2.2. So here's the public message that I like to rely on. In encouraging people to water with native plants, we can't guarantee what the future holds for water availability for any planting. If we didn't get these rains that we just got unexpectedly, people in the water world were quietly starting to talk about before the next year's out, some areas might have complete bans on outdoor irrigation. So obviously our native plants, we like to water them, once a month or so, maybe a little bit more often to keep them looking fresh. They might not look great in that. So I can't guarantee the future of water availability, but I can guarantee that if appropriately designed, a native garden will be the most resilient option for landscaping in the face of whatever future watering restrictions can come. If we go down to zero irrigation, they will either look the best out of anything else or might be the only landscapes in the neighborhood to survive. And so in addition to all the other benefits, that's a nice built-in benefit. If we look at this in terms of annual irrigation likely to be applied to a garden, cool season turf, over 55 inches of water, whereas typical range for native plants, 9 to at the very high end, a little less than 20 inches if people are really kind of irrigating them to keep them quite lush. And so with that, here's kind of how it breaks down into percentages. Irrigated established native landscapes can be expected to receive between 84% and 64% less water than an appropriately watered cool season turf grass landscape. So significant. And that's by planted surface area. If you add into the fact that a native design that was totally replacing the big area of turf is likely to have completely unirrigated areas like some patio spaces, walkways, things like that don't get irrigated, the savings could easily be higher. The typical backyard replacing turf is probably going to have between 1/4 and 1/3 of that space as some sort of open area, patio seating space or whatever. So those savings would be even higher. Could easily represent for the typical single family household, 42 to 32% reduction in total water use by swapping out appropriately watered lawn to keep the lawn healthy throughout the year with native plants. So huge savings for water supply. And so for people who really want to go into it, we're going to make the download of these slides available. I have these kind of charts that also break down what that means in relation to specific local watering restrictions. But in the interest of time, I will kind of skip through that. If people really are those, want to be able to advocate and understand all of this, I'm happy to have email conversations with people later to make sure this is all understandable. But essentially, the the takeaway from this is that if you are in an area where there's very strict water restrictions, like, you know, 1 time per week or 2 times per week for 8 minutes on a sprinkler system, and that is what it is. Well, here's what that's going to come out to is for people who are going to try to water native plants appropriately with those deep, infrequent irrigation that would clearly violate the terms of those you're supposed to water twice a week for 8 minutes. Your water bill or monthly water meeting is still going to look identical to someone actively following those turf restrictions. The total amount of water that you're allotted is actually going to be very compatible with how we would water our native gardens anyways, this turf that's getting restricted. And so you can kind of do what you will, but you would be able to turn around and advocate for the fact that you are using no more water than especially those twice a week, 8-minute style restrictions that are very common throughout Southern California right now. The other thing is that water agencies are continuing to encourage the planting of waterwise and native landscapes, but many watering restrictions don't currently allow for sufficient use of spray systems to establish those new landscapes right now. That 1 inch, half an inch once per week. And so again, being ready to rely on some numbers like I presented here and turn around and say, well, you're telling me to do this, but this is what the plant physiology demands, you'll probably never be called out on it, but is a way that you can confidently then, if that does come up as an issue, ask to speak with someone and explain it to them. And if you are armed with this sort of information, in most cases, you'll be given the benefit of the doubt because you will know more than they do. Yeah. Yeah.
Can they
Yes, definitely. So the question from Orchid was, if somebody has to have that conversation and prepare them for it, can they contact me? Absolutely. I would be happy to speak with anyone who has to do that because I also want to track what water districts are actually, you know, where they are on that and how those conversations go. So yeah, I would be very happy to trade some sort of like prep information and even sending you charts and tables and things like that in exchange for hearing how it went and what the result of that conversation was. Definitely. And so we're going to wrap up with then kind of some recommendations for engagement, which is just kind of what Orchid just brought up. Recommendations for what people wanting to promote native plants can do. Engagement with watering agencies around watering schedule allowances for establishment irrigation of native gardens. With a clear and simple approval process for exemptions to standard restrictions that stick with the same kind of talking points that those water agencies are making in terms of switching over to native landscapes, but making sure that that corresponds with what people are actually being able to officially do with their watering practices. Other recommendations for engagement. Engaging with water agencies around equivalent restrictions for monthly irrigation allowances, especially with spray. Most of the time on drip irrigation systems, they kind of leave you to do what you want. But this is a whole other topic. But if I was doing a presentation around irrigation practices for native plants, drip is not always the best option. It can be done. But I strongly believe that in real world situations, looking at maintenance, line breaks, and things like that, high efficiency spray systems are just as effective, longer lived, and better for the plants if the geometry of the space works out. So making sure that if someone has actually taken the steps that the water agencies are promoting and shifting over to a native landscape, that they are allowed to irrigate appropriately, and that there's an equivalent restriction eventually is where we should be, so that people aren't necessarily watering more in terms of water use than those restrictions clearly set up for lawns, but they are given an official go-ahead to be able to do what they need to do to water native plants. There's still a big gap there. And again, most native gardeners, because their water bills, their total monthly usage is going to look appropriate, aren't going to have to deal with that. But kind of the next step is to really have it set up so that water agencies can more effectively promote the conversion of native landscapes by giving people really kind of a clear pathway to water appropriately. Engagement with water agencies around real specific things. Some of the number of minutes that you're allowed to water actually penalize people who have, again, done the right thing and moved to these higher efficiency spray systems that let water out much more slowly. Even the numbers from some of the water agencies that give higher allotments for it, the people at those agencies clearly don't fully understand the difference, because those higher allotments saying you can water 16 minutes instead of 8 minutes are still penalizing the people in the total volume they can put out for the high efficiency thing. So there's a lot of work we can do in terms of communication. And again, if you have the ear of someone at your local water agency and there's been issues, yeah, pull me into the conversation. Happy to engage with you or with them about it. And then engagement with community members, because hand watering is not being restricted. And hand watering can be worth it. And in fact, is the least expensive way to irrigate. Doesn't require a lot of stuff, doesn't require a high level of technical knowledge, does require some time. But if you come to our irrigation related courses at the Waterwise Community Center, we teach people how you can successfully water by hand throughout all the stages of the growth of your plants. We recommend a little device that's a few pieces put together that actually will track the number of gallons you're using, so you really can have a almost foolproof way of doing it. So providing opportunities for people to be able to do that as well. And so to wrap everything up and then go into questions, here is our highest attendance in-person workshop that we've ever hosted, kind of title. And we actually did use California native in the talk, but we said native last. So colorful and drought proof, design your own California native garden. And we find that is so far our most effective way to really invite people into the fabulous world of having native plants outside your house and in community, and invite people in to participate in all of those benefits. So thank you very much for inviting me out. And with that, here's my contact information on the last slide, the links referenced in the presentation. And as well, your main homework assignment is to sign up for my agency's email list, which is the same start, cbwcd.org, followed by /newsletter. And with that, oh my gosh, you can't even see this at all in here. Yeah, it on my computer, which wasn't connecting, these all show up as white, and this is the one format change. So my email is SKLEINROCK at C as in cat, B as in boy, W as in water, C as in conservation, D as in district.org. And the main links referenced in the presentation are waterwisegardenplanner.org, which is our online kind of main hub. And from the different parts there, you can see our plant profiles, kind of plant search functions, design content. And then there's a resources section at the end where you can get to our YouTube page and sign up and see our upcoming in-person workshops at the Waterwise Community Center in Montclair. Yeah. Oh, excellent. I can email like all of the links, and then that'll be great. Thanks. Okay, so an email will be coming out that will send all of the relevant links. Oh, they'll be posted on the website. Okay, thank you for correcting me. Even better. So main links will get posted on the website. Do we have any questions? I guess I can pull up.
This is Katie, and I can read the questions for you. There is a question from Thomas messaging. What is the best conversion from irrigation measured as inches per week to drip systems, timer settings per dripper?
Okay, so the question from Thomas for everyone here: what is the best conversion from irrigation measured in inches per week to drip systems, timer settings per dripper? That is, it depends on how your drip system is set up. That's very, okay, it's pretty easy to do if you installed, like how we recommend if you are going to use drip irrigation is installed, which is called a drip irrigation grid, which is not just one or two little emitters to each plant, but you're using the line where the emitters are already in the tube, usually every foot, and you're laying them out in parallel lines throughout the whole planting area, so that essentially there's a distribution of those emitters over the area, where when you turn it on, it's almost as if it rained or the sprinklers went off, the whole area gets an even soak. That's called a drip irrigation grid. If you are installing a grid, you can look up the specifications from the manufacturer, and usually it's actually even in a little table on the outside of the package of tube, and it will basically say the number of inches per hour that grid puts out, like the precipitation rate. So it might say the typical grid that we use at the Waterwise Community Center in our drip zones puts out 1 inch per hour. So it's very easy to know how to water an inch and a half an inch. If you have a drip system that waters just a few emitters at the base of a plant, that's more complicated. The important thing to know is you need to move them farther away from the base of the plant and add more over time, because that gets very problematic with how native plants grow. But you're going to be converting that into gallons and knowing per shrub how many gallons you need to put down for the size of the shrub to be the equivalent of 1 inch of water. So it's more confusing. On this presentation, there is actually a slide. That's part of how we teach people to hand water as well. There's a slide that kind of shows that breakdown. But what I can do is, well, two things. One, I encourage you, check out the resources on our YouTube page and come to courses at the Waterwise Community Center if you're close, because we teach people how to do all of this in intimate detail. There's a course we teach called Retrofitting Turf Irrigation Systems for Waterwise and Native Gardens, where we go deep into how to do all of this, whether you're hand watering, drip, or spray. I also have a handout that we made because not everyone can come to that course. That's my best take on how to explain this all, no matter what type of irrigation you have, whether it's set up ideally or not. And I have a PDF of that, and I could share that through the coordinators here, and we can make that available to people however, if there's interest. And then if you have follow-up questions, there's an email address on there that you can send follow-up questions to, because we're constantly revising that document, really trying to make it as simple as possible. Because as you can get from that, the answer is not super simple, and we're trying to make it something that every single person can understand. So we'll get a link to that out somehow. Are there any other questions in the chat? Okay, Orchid.
A question comment in the chat from Leslie. Thanks for the presentation. Barriers I have found, there is limited access to native plants, not many locations to purchase in the region.
Yes, so one of the barriers, limited access to native plants. And unfortunately, with the increase in native plants, I feel like last year there was some of it. This year, the nurseries have, I think, bounced back from the supply chain issues. Like the first year of COVID, nurseries couldn't get enough 1-gallon pots. This year, they've bounced back, but the interest has been so high that there are just plants that have been sold out of the whole industry for months. I'm seeing at a local nursery where I was, one of the few local nurseries that has hummingbird sage, for example, really popular native plant, they were selling 1-gallon plants for $32. This is the most I've ever seen. So there's a few things that need to happen. One is that nurseries are trying to respond, and fortunately, I sit on one committee of kind of more mainstream nurseries, and there's been more and more talk from some of those mainstream nurseries of realizing that this is where demand is heading and shifting more production into native plants. So that's a great thing. That takes a few years to catch up. Because of that gap, as advocates for native plants, we are going to need to do more work to make sure that these plants are available as well. And whether that's local plant sales or even working with wholesale nurseries for local plant sales to put in orders ahead of time, which might take a deposit to get things custom grown and reserved, that's might be part of it for a few years. Orchid.
Or
Passing the mic.
one thing I have found is that some nurseries can order from a San Diego wholesale nursery called Moosa Creek, and they have a weekly delivery schedule for this area and parts of the San Bernardino, Yucaipa. So Sunshine Nursery does order from them, and so that is also an option.
Yeah, and then if you're probably most people are this way, but yeah, closer to me, Glendora Gardens has that same relationship with Moosa Creek Nursery, and even in the San Gabriel Valley, San Gabriel Nursery has that same relationship. That's a really great one. What was the one in Riverside? Parkview Nursery in Riverside as well. Yeah, and then part of it also is sometimes being willing to substitute plants, or also being willing to wait. And sometimes plants are only available in spring, even though we want to wait in fall. But one of the big things that we are looking at the Waterwise Community Center, because for years we haven't wanted to get involved in this, but really we are seeing that we're getting more and more people. They're interested in one of our design templates, and then they can't find the plants. And there's probably, when we talk about expanding and advocating for those people who don't want to be gardeners to become involved with native plants, there's probably about 30 to 40 top native plants out of all the hundreds of them that we would encourage that most people at least start with. And so what we are currently assessing right now and having conversations by the week is, what is the most effective way that we can say, take the list of our top 30 native plants and try to make sure that those plants are available throughout as much of the planting season as possible, so that people can have access to those. Because for people who are into the rarer stuff, you know, there are great botanical garden nurseries. There are nonprofits that have this really incredible stuff that I'm always excited to come home with. But really, to expand this kind of movement, it's how do we get those 30 plants and make sure that people can buy Toyon, California buckwheat, deergrass, and many other things, you know, every week throughout the planting season. That's kind of our current goal at the Waterwise Community Center. Yeah.
I'm CMPS Live California program. Maybe you can mention that as one of the mechanisms for trying to get more nurseries.
I am aware of it, but maybe not as much as
Okay,
you.
You can go online and just type in California Bloom, or California, and then or go to cmps.org and look for it there on the website. So the California Bloom program is CMPS. There's a group of people in CMPS that actually visit the nurseries, you know, to make sure they're reputable nurseries. They bring them into the program, encourage them to be carrying certain native plants. They've come up with a list, a good starting list, that can be used in different parts of the state. You know, it varies where you are. So that's one of the things that CMPS is trying to do to get more native plants available to the general public. So there are mechanisms in place to try to fix this problem. It's just slow.
Thank you. You did a much better job explaining it than I could have. So. Okay.
Scott, we have some more questions for you from the Q&A.
Okay, and I actually can see the Q&A now.
Okay, I can go ahead then. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, let's go. Okay, let's go to the next one. From Anonymous. Do you have advice for us or others to educate or work with landscape professionals on using California native plants in yards that are professionally designed? I've noticed lots of xeriscape or pollinator gardens designed or installed by landscapers or garden maintenance professionals that look great, but nearly all the plants are not native, which misses the extra benefits. Less summer watering, post plants with pollinators on the right track. I don't know who this anonymous person is. I promise I did not plant them in this to ask this question. Yes, so professional training is definitely needed. Theodore Payne Foundation, which I mentioned before, nonprofit based in Sun Valley in the San Fernando Valley, has working with California Native Plant Society, kind of they're handling Southern California, the CNPS NorCal is handling Northern California. In 2021, I believe, launched a professionally focused, see if I can get the acronym right, CNPLC, California Native Plant Landscaper Certificate Program, which is a curriculum of 20 hours of training. It's kind of the crash course in native plants, ID, what's cool about them, how to successfully take care of them. Currently, they're being funded by Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, so it's open to area professionals in there, and they've ran about over 400 people through the program now. So they're expanding. 2,000 people on the wait list. On this last Monday, we got the official approval from our board to collaborate with CNPS, signed a memorandum of understanding, and we are going to be bringing that program out to our area for professionals who have a service area that includes Eastern San Bernardino County. We are kind of the guinea pig. I believe that Santa Barbara is kind of next in line to talk about adding them in. And the idea is that essentially we are forming a committee to talk about how do we expand this curriculum throughout the area. But that's what collectively we're working on. And the idea is hopefully there'll eventually be kind of different agencies involved through some sort of mechanism teaching this throughout as much of California as possible to get this information to the landscape industry, because you're right, there's lots of hardworking landscape professionals who just don't have this content. So yeah, we're trying to expand that, and also part of that is trying to promote how this can also increase the business opportunities for landscape professionals as well. It's definitely not just saying you should be doing native plants because that's the right thing to do, but it's talking about how to build up one's business through gaining the skill set. So, great question. Yeah, but that is great. Yeah, how are we on time? Okay. Okay, yeah, I'm good. Okay, so LJ also typed in that another nursery in Riverside is Louis Nursery that partners with Moosa Creek. Okay, so a couple more questions. I'll do them out of order because I do want to be able to show this. So, do we have programs, handouts, etc., to teach pruning and timing for maintenance of native gardens? Yes, we do have programs. If you are close enough where you can come to the Waterwise Garden Center, our public garden in Montclair, we teach seasonal workshops that are all hands-on in the garden, spring, summer, fall, and winter. That's basically what you should be doing and thinking about now. And again, because we try to be inclusive and we don't just say native, we say Waterwise and native gardens, but mostly we focus on native plants and native garden, talk about how the concept can be applied. And so, yeah, those are done hands-on in our garden quarterly, free and open to the public. And we are currently working on a project right now that are creating basically maintenance guides for all of our templates that we have, so that people who are interested in focusing mostly on kind of the average community member who wants to start with, a 15 plant concept, maintenance guides for that. Also on the Waterwise Garden Planner website, which has, it's not all native, but we have, I think, 114 native plants. So most of the basic palette, and we don't have like every manzanita, but there's enough manzanitas that you can kind of get the maintenance information for them. Every single one of those profiles has the maintenance information on that. So those are our current. Yes.
Okay, this is Arlie again. I just want to mention that there is a dire need to educate landscape maintenance contractors. I just want to show you this picture of a Quercus agrifolia in a city parking lot. Okay, so just so people know, maybe you can show it, just. You can't. Okay, it looks like a gumdrop. This is at Sycamore Canyon Wilderness Park by the Nature Center. The landscape contractor trimmed, he hedged all the sages so that they're not going to bloom now. And they turned the Quercus agrifolia into a gumdrop on a stick. So this is going out on throughout.
Yeah, and it's, yeah, and a lot of it is, you know, just a different approach, because for those of you who didn't see it, it's a beautiful gumdrop. And that gumdrop took a lot of time and effort to put in. And I couldn't have carved a gumdrop that symmetrically out of an oak tree. There was a lot of work that went into it that could have, I mean, a couple of, at that age, a couple of choice pruning cuts with a pole saw would probably have been all that was needed. And then they could have moved on to doing something else. And so, yeah, exactly. And then, okay, from, I think the last question from Thomas, let's see, I'm gonna move the chat. It is, you have a list of the 10 or more most bulletproof natives to introduce that provide year-round color and habitat. Thank you for the question, Thomas. Let's go out of here. And we didn't really have time in the presentation, but I was looking for a excuse to show off the loading meeting control, show off the garden planner website. But on our Waterwise garden planner website, if you go to helpful lists, the first list is top 10 plants for Southern California gardens. Now, Riverside, San Bernardino was a big area. This doesn't really apply to high elevation, doesn't really apply to the true desert, but through all of the valley areas, you know, Riverside through San Fernando Valley and pretty much out to the coast, there's actually 12 plants on this list because we want to provide a little bit, but like the very top for people who are just getting started, trees, some of these are shrubs you can kind of turn into trees, shrubs, perennials, and then a grass. And you can put together a very nice kind of long blooming garden with just the plants on this list. These are in my ideal world, people would be able to go to Home Depot and Lowe's and buy these plants. Hopefully we'll get there one day, but until then, yeah, these are going to be like this is kind of almost my top list of plants that I want to make sure that we have some way of getting people access to kind of year round. So let's see. I think, do we have, yes.
Early in your presentation, you mentioned how important it was that municipalities also put, for example, medians and things like that. However, a lot of municipalities require recycled water for irrigation. And as you know, recycled water has different qualities. And also the Ukaipa Water District, the Valley Water District, for example, their front and back are houses is on recycled water as well.
Yep.
So my question is, has the RCC have a list of plants that are tolerant of recycled water or even thrive? Some plants are very salt tolerant.
Yep. So the question was about recycled water. So our demonstration facility is on recycled water. And it's also a post-industrial site that used to be owned by a gravel concrete aggregate company. Some areas still have high compaction, all sorts of issues. I live 5 minutes away, and compared to my house, gardening at our work is like gardening on the moon or something like that. And sometimes it's frustrating, but in many ways that's great for a demonstration garden, because if it grows there, chances are people can grow it at home. And we have areas, lots of areas, because of all the little beds of how it was originally laid out, They're not only on recycled water, but they're recycled water with drip. You know, what people would say would be the nightmare scenario for native plants. The vast majority of native plants do fine. There are only a couple of native plants that I've really struggled to grow there. And I suspect it's the water, but I don't know. Like weird things like California fescue, which is super easy most. I just can't keep it alive there. But almost everything else does well. But the key, I believe, is water management. If we were watering with our recycled water into establishment every week or 2 days a week, and we're only watering shallowly so that all of those salts are concentrated in the upper soil, which is often when native landscapes go in municipal spaces, how they continue to be watered. We see that more commercial. We have a program where we do audits, but I suspect some of the municipal ones are well. Plants in an establishment period have a frequent watering schedule. Sometimes it's even too frequent. We see it as like 2 days a week, 3 days a week. And as the plants are getting established, they're looking pretty good. And the landscape crews are not going to make any changes until things look really bad. So sometimes, and so what that's doing is frequent shallow irrigations, concentrating all of the salts, never getting the deep flush out of there. But when we are watering once every 3 weeks with a deep irrigation, the vast majority of things do just fine. So that's been a nice surprise. Orchid.